The man at the gate looked me straight in the eyes and told me I was trespassing on land my grandfather had spent his entire life protecting. Even now, I can still hear those words as clearly as the metallic click that echoed through the security gate that morning. I remember tightening my grip around the worn leather folder resting against my chest, feeling the cracked edges of the original property deed beneath my fingers as if touching it could somehow make the situation make sense. My name is Ryan Carter. I am 39 years old, and until that morning I believed inheriting 1,100 acres of family ranch land would mean little more than restoring an old property that had been sitting untouched for years. Instead, I found an entire upscale neighborhood standing where my family's cattle once grazed. The first thing I noticed was not the houses. It was the smell. Fresh-cut grass mixed with flowering shrubs and newly poured concrete, replacing the familiar scent of cedar, wild sage, and open pasture that had filled every childhood summer I could remember. The old gravel road leading toward our ranch had disappeared beneath smooth asphalt lined with decorative street lamps, carefully planted maple trees, and stone entrance walls displaying polished bronze letters that proudly announced Silver Creek Estates. For several long seconds, I simply sat inside my pickup truck, staring through the windshield, convinced I had somehow taken the wrong road. I checked the faded county map folded across the passenger seat. I checked the GPS coordinates stored in my phone. Then I looked down at the original deed signed decades earlier. Every document pointed to the exact place where I was sitting. My family ranch had not vanished. It had been covered. I slowly stepped out of the truck, the morning air surprisingly quiet except for birds singing somewhere behind rows of expensive homes and the distant hum of lawn equipment. The entrance fountain sent crystal clear water into the sunlight while American flags moved gently in the breeze beside perfectly trimmed hedges. Families walked dogs along clean sidewalks. Children laughed near a small lake I had never seen before. Everything looked peaceful, organized, and permanent. That was what unsettled me most. Nobody acted as though anything was wrong because nobody believed anything was wrong. I walked toward the gate carrying the leather folder beneath my arm until a uniformed security guard stepped forward with a professional smile that disappeared the moment I explained why I was there. I introduced myself and told him I had inherited the Carter Ranch. He frowned politely before glancing toward the neighborhood behind him. "Sir," he said carefully, "this is private HOA property." I smiled because I assumed it was an honest misunderstanding. I opened the folder and carefully unfolded the original deed, showing him the legal description, my grandfather's name, the county recording stamp, and every page proving ownership stretching back generations. He studied the documents for only a few seconds before shaking his head. "I cannot let you enter," he replied. "If you remain here, you will be trespassing." Those words settled over the morning like cold rain. Trespassing. On land my grandfather taught me to ride horses across before I was old enough to reach the stirrups. Trespassing beside the creek where he taught me how to fish. Trespassing where our red barn once stood. I slowly looked beyond the gates again, searching for anything familiar. Then I noticed it. An old line of mature oak trees still stretched across the horizon exactly where I remembered them. They had survived everything. The subdivision had been built around them instead of removing them. In that moment, I realized something that made my stomach tighten. The land underneath those streets had never changed. Only the story people believed about it had. I stayed parked outside the entrance for almost an hour after the security guard walked back to his gatehouse. I was not angry. I was trying to understand how an entire neighborhood could exist on land that had never left my family's hands. The answer was not waiting behind that gate. It was somewhere in the past, buried beneath years I had spent building a different life. My grandfather, Samuel Carter, used to tell me that land remembered everything, even when people forgot. As a boy, I never understood what he meant. To me, the ranch was simply home. I grew up chasing calves across open pasture, repairing broken fences beside him, and listening to the rhythmic creaking of the old windmill that never seemed to stop turning. Every Saturday morning, we would ride horseback before sunrise, crossing fields covered with dew while the smell of fresh earth mixed with cedar and wild grass. He knew every hill, every creek, every cluster of oak trees without ever needing a map. Sometimes he would stop his horse in complete silence and simply look across the valley. Then he would smile and say, "One day this land will be worth more than money." It will be worth remembering. At the time, I thought he was talking about family traditions. Years later, I realized he was talking about something much larger. My parents passed away when I was still in college, leaving my grandfather and me to keep the ranch running together whenever I came home during breaks. He never asked me to stay. In fact, he encouraged me to leave. He believed education was another kind of inheritance. I studied civil engineering because I loved understanding how things were built, how foundations carried weight, and how measurements could reveal the truth even when appearances could not. After graduation, I accepted projects across several states, designing highways, bridges, and water systems. Every few weeks, my grandfather and I spoke on the telephone. He always told me the ranch was doing fine, even when I suspected he was hiding the hard work behind those simple words. Then came the phone call I had dreaded for years. He passed away peacefully in his sleep just after his 86th birthday. Losing him felt like losing the last person who truly knew our family story. The inheritance process became far more complicated than anyone expected because several neighboring parcels had outdated records dating back decades. Probate stretched into months. Then months became years. My engineering projects continued taking me farther from home, while attorneys assured me everything would eventually be resolved. I believed them. Looking back now, that may have been my greatest mistake. I assumed land waited patiently for its owner. I never considered that people might begin treating silence like permission. Sitting in my truck outside Silver Creek Estates, I closed my eyes and pictured the old ranch exactly as it had been during my last visit with my grandfather. The red barn stood beside a weathered equipment shed. A narrow gravel road curved toward the farmhouse porch where two wooden rocking chairs overlooked hundreds of acres of open fields. Beyond the pasture stretched a line of towering oak trees that marked the western boundary. When I opened my eyes again, those same oak trees still stood in the distance beyond expensive homes, decorative fountains, and perfectly paved streets. They were the only familiar landmarks left. Everything else had changed, yet the deed resting beside me had not. Neither had the legal description printed across its yellowed pages. Somewhere between my grandfather's final days and my return to the ranch, two completely different versions of history had begun occupying the same piece of land. I knew one of them had to be wrong, and for the first time I realized proving the truth would require far more than simply holding the original deed. I returned to the entrance the following morning because I wanted answers from someone who had the authority to give them. The security guard recognized my truck before I even reached the gate. This time he spoke into his radio before stepping outside, his expression professional but noticeably uncomfortable. He asked me to wait a few minutes because the president of the homeowners association was on her way. I parked beside the visitor lane and watched another ordinary day unfold inside the neighborhood. A landscaping crew trimmed hedges with perfect precision. A delivery van rolled through the entrance without stopping. Several residents waved politely to one another while walking their dogs beneath rows of flowering trees. Everything looked exactly like the kind of community my grandfather would have admired for its cleanliness and order. That made what I was about to do feel even stranger. A few minutes later, a dark blue luxury sedan pulled smoothly toward the entrance and stopped beside the gatehouse. A woman stepped out with calm confidence, dressed in a tailored navy blazer over a crisp white blouse. Her blonde hair was neatly styled, and every movement suggested someone accustomed to making decisions without raising her voice. She extended her hand before introducing herself. "I am Claire Donovan, president of the Silver Creek Estates Homeowners Association." Her smile was polite, measured, and completely controlled. I introduced myself in return and handed her the leather folder containing my grandfather's deed. Unlike the security guard, she accepted the documents without hesitation. She carefully examined the county recording stamp, the legal description, and every signature before closing the folder again. What surprised me was not what she said. It was what she did not say. She never claimed the deed was fake. She never questioned my identity. She never suggested the documents had been altered. Instead, she handed the folder back to me and folded her hands calmly in front of her. "Mr. Carter," she said, "I understand why this situation appears confusing. However, this community has existed for many years. Hundreds of families purchased homes here through legal transactions. Property taxes have been paid. Utilities have been maintained. Roads have been dedicated. At some point, communities become established realities. I listened carefully because every word mattered. That does not answer my question, I replied. How did my family's land become an entire neighborhood? She paused briefly before looking beyond the gate toward the houses behind her. History is often more complicated than individual documents, she answered. Sometimes land changes through processes that occur over decades. Ownership is not always as simple as what appears on paper. I looked down at the deed still resting in my hands. Then show me the document that transferred ownership. For the first time, her confident expression shifted ever so slightly. It was not fear. It was hesitation. Only for a second. I am not the county recorder, she replied. Our association manages the community as it exists today. If you believe there is an issue with historical records, that would be something to discuss with the appropriate government offices. It was a careful answer, but it left one important fact untouched. She still had not identified a single document proving my family had ever sold the land. Before returning to her car, she offered one final sentence. I hope you understand that disrupting this neighborhood would affect hundreds of innocent families. I watched her drive away while those words echoed through my mind. She had framed the situation as though I wanted conflict, when all I had done was ask one simple question. Where was the transfer of ownership? As the security gates slowly closed once again, I realized Claire Donovan believed time itself had become stronger than recorded history. She was convinced that if enough years passed, people would stop asking how the story had actually begun. I spent the next several days chasing records instead of rumors because I had learned something important during my conversation with Claire Donovan. She never argued with my documents. She simply relied on the fact that nobody had questioned the neighborhood's existence for years. As an engineer, I trusted measurements more than assumptions, and every property dispute eventually returned to one place, the official record. My first stop was the county recorder's office, a brick building that looked almost unchanged from the last time my grandfather had taken me there as a teenager. Inside, shelves filled with decades of archived plats and bound record books stretched across quiet rooms that smelled faintly of paper, dust, and old wood. I explained my situation to the clerk, who listened patiently before typing my family's parcel number into her computer. Several minutes passed as she compared digital files with archived records. Finally, she frowned. The original parcel is still listed, she said carefully, but there have been numerous subdivision filings around it over the years. Around it, not instead of it. That single word immediately caught my attention. I requested copies of every recorded plat connected to the surrounding properties and left carrying a stack of maps nearly 2 inches thick. My next stop was the county planning department. The planner on duty pulled aerial photographs dating back more than 20 years. I watched the images change year after year as empty fields slowly became construction sites, then paved roads, then rows of completed homes. The transformation happened gradually, almost invisibly, until an entire community stood where open pasture had once stretched to the horizon. Yet something about the maps bothered me. The subdivision boundaries seemed to stop just short of matching the legal description printed on my grandfather's deed. It was subtle, almost impossible to notice without comparing multiple layers, but the lines did not fit together perfectly. I asked whether anyone could explain the discrepancy. The planner shook his head politely. If there is a boundary conflict, that is a civil matter. We approve submitted plans, but ownership questions are resolved elsewhere. That phrase followed me everywhere. Civil matter. The sheriff's office gave me the same answer when I asked whether I could legally enter land described in my recorded deed. They explained that without a court order, they could not determine competing claims of ownership. Nobody accused me of being wrong. Nobody confirmed that I was right. Every office acknowledged the possibility of a dispute while quietly passing responsibility to someone else. Before leaving town, I contacted an independent licensed surveyor named Mark Ellis, a man whose reputation for accuracy had earned respect across 3 counties. We met that afternoon over coffee, where I spread my grandfather's deed beside the newly copied subdivision plats. Mark studied the documents for several long minutes without saying a word. Then he reached into his bag, removed a ruler, and began aligning legal descriptions with survey bearings. His eyebrows slowly narrowed. "These measurements deserve another look," he finally said. We arranged to inspect the property 2 days later, but when Mark submitted the routine notice required before beginning a boundary survey near occupied lots, unexpected delays appeared almost immediately. Additional approvals were suddenly requested. Access questions surfaced. Phone calls that normally took hours to return stretched into days. Nothing was openly denied, yet every simple step became unusually complicated. Driving back toward the old ranch that evening, I realized I had not uncovered proof that anyone had intentionally done something wrong. What I had uncovered was something almost as revealing. The closer I moved toward the original property lines, the more invisible obstacles seemed to appear between me and the truth. I could have waited for the survey delays to resolve themselves, but something my grandfather used to say kept returning to me. He always believed that if the courthouse records ever became confusing, the ranch itself would still know the truth. At the time, I thought he was speaking like an old rancher who loved his land too much. Standing beside what remained of our abandoned homestead, I finally understood he had been speaking literally. The original ranch house still stood on the far edge of the property, separated from the subdivision by several hundred yards of neglected pasture that had somehow escaped development. The white paint had faded long ago, several porch boards creaked beneath my boots, and the windmill no longer turned, but every room still carried echoes of the place where I had grown up. Dust floated through narrow beams of afternoon sunlight, while the familiar scent of old cedar mixed with dry wood and weathered leather. I spent hours opening cabinets, clearing shelves, and searching through closets that had not been touched since my grandfather passed away. Most of what I found were ordinary reminders of a life built through decades of hard work. Rusted horseshoes, feed invoices, family photographs, handwritten notebooks filled with rainfall measurements stretching back nearly 40 years. Nothing explained how an entire neighborhood had appeared across our ranch. As evening approached, I walked into the small office where my grandfather handled ranch business. The heavy oak desk remained exactly where he had left it. His reading glasses still rested beside an old brass desk lamp covered with a thin layer of dust. I slowly opened each drawer, until I reached the bottom one, where something caught my attention. The drawer did not slide back as far as it should have. Kneeling beside it, I noticed a narrow wooden panel hidden beneath the interior. Carefully lifting it free revealed a shallow compartment I had never seen before. Inside rested a cedar chest no larger than a briefcase, its brass hinges slightly tarnished but otherwise perfectly preserved. My pulse quickened as I carried it onto the desk and slowly opened the lid. The unmistakable scent of cedar drifted into the room. Inside were neatly organized document tubes, sealed envelopes, several rolled survey maps tied with faded leather straps, and a handwritten note resting on top in my grandfather's careful block lettering. The note contained only one sentence: "If the land is ever questioned, begin here." My hands trembled slightly as I unfolded the first survey. It was the original licensed boundary survey completed decades earlier, complete with official seals, survey bearings, iron monument references, and handwritten field notes. Every measurement matched the legal description printed on the deed I had carried since arriving. Beneath it lay another document labeled Utility Easement Agreement, then another for road access, then another allowing temporary drainage improvements. One after another, every agreement granted permission for limited use of specific portions of the property while repeating nearly identical language. Access granted. Maintenance permitted. Ownership retained by the Carter family. I stopped reading for a moment because one phrase appeared again and again with remarkable consistency. No conveyance of title. Those 4 words seemed almost too simple after everything I had experienced. I continued sorting through the documents until I found a folded topographical map covered with my grandfather's handwritten notes in blue ink. Several property lines had been carefully traced, while certain easement corridors were circled with arrows pointing toward a single sentence written across the margin. Never confuse permission with ownership. I sat quietly in the fading light, surrounded by papers older than many of the homes now. Standing beyond the ranch. For the first time since returning, I no longer felt as though I was searching for answers. I felt as though my grandfather had anticipated this exact moment years before it ever happened, leaving behind a trail that only someone willing to look beyond appearances would ever find. The next morning, I spread every document across the long oak dining table inside the ranch house, arranging them in the same order my grandfather had carefully preserved them years earlier. The original deed rested beside the licensed boundary survey. The easement agreements formed another stack. The subdivision plats I had collected from the county recorder occupied the opposite side of the table. For the first time, every piece of the puzzle was sitting in one room. I called Mark Ellis and asked him to come to the ranch instead of meeting at his office. When he arrived, he walked slowly around the table without saying a word. As an experienced surveyor, he understood that documents often told stories long before anyone stepped into the field. Nearly an hour passed before he finally looked up. "I think your grandfather knew exactly what he was protecting," he said quietly. We began comparing the legal descriptions line by line, coordinate by coordinate, using modern mapping software alongside the original field notes. As a civil engineer, I had spent years reviewing construction drawings measured to fractions of an inch, and I immediately noticed something that had escaped me before. Every easement described a limited corridor with precise widths and defined purposes. One granted utility access. Another allowed emergency road maintenance. Another permitted drainage improvements across a narrow section of the ranch. None of them transferred ownership. More importantly, every easement specifically identified the Carter family as the continuing property owner. Mark overlaid the original survey onto the county's most recent geographic information system maps. The screen filled with colored boundary lines that slowly aligned as layer after layer became visible. The subdivision roads matched several historic easement corridors almost perfectly. Clubhouse parking areas overlapped temporary construction access zones that had been authorized decades earlier. Walking trails followed utility rights-of-way established long before the first house had been built. It was as though someone had gradually mistaken permission to use portions of the land for ownership of the land itself. The distinction seemed obvious once every document was viewed together. Yet without the original surveys hidden inside the cedar chest, almost nobody would have recognized the difference. We spent the remainder of the afternoon verifying every monument reference listed in the field notes. Several iron survey markers were still visible beneath brush near the abandoned pasture. Others had disappeared during development, but enough remained to confirm that the original property boundaries had never changed. The coordinates matched within modern surveying tolerances despite being recorded decades earlier. That level of consistency was difficult to ignore. Before leaving, Mark looked directly at me. "You do not have a measurement problem," he said. "You have a record interpretation problem. Those are very different." His observation stayed with me long after he drove away. I contacted a real estate attorney named Emily Brooks the following morning and delivered copies of every document we had organized. She spent 2 days reviewing the files before calling me into her office. The first thing she did was place the original easement agreements beside the current subdivision plats. Then she circled the same recurring phrase my grandfather had underlined years earlier. No conveyance of title. Emily leaned back in her chair and folded her hands thoughtfully. "If these documents are authentic and everything I have verified so far indicates they are, then the foundation of this dispute is not whether your family owned the ranch. The foundation is whether limited rights granted decades ago were gradually treated as permanent ownership through later assumptions." Hearing those words felt strangely calm instead of dramatic. Nobody had uncovered a secret contract or a forgotten sale. The evidence pointed towards something far more ordinary and, perhaps, far more significant. The land had been measured correctly from the beginning. Somewhere along the way, people had simply stopped reading the documents closely enough to remember what those measurements actually meant. Emily Brooks was not interested in dramatic courtroom speeches or emotional arguments. She believed that every successful property case was won long before anyone entered a courtroom. It was won through preparation, consistency, and patience. Over the following 3 weeks, our small team quietly built a case that relied entirely on facts. Every morning I returned to the ranch house, where the dining table had slowly transformed into a temporary archive. The original deed remained at the center, surrounded by survey maps, easement agreements, county plats, aerial photographs, tax records, engineering overlays, and handwritten notes that connected one document to another. We did not begin with conclusions. We began with questions, allowing every answer to lead naturally to the next piece of evidence. Mark Ellis completed a modern boundary survey using the surviving iron monuments identified in my grandfather's field notes. Every measurement confirmed what the original survey had established decades earlier. Emily requested certified copies of historical filings directly from the county archives to eliminate any concern that our documents had been altered over time. We also obtained aerial imagery from multiple years, creating a visual timeline that showed exactly how the subdivision expanded across the former ranch. The sequence revealed something remarkable. Roads had first appeared along recorded easement corridors. Utility lines followed those same corridors. Later, additional improvements gradually spread outward from them. Nothing in the visual record showed a formal transfer of ownership. It showed growth, expansion, and assumption. As an engineer, I created transparent overlays combining the historic survey with current satellite imagery. When the layers aligned, the result was impossible to ignore. Property corners established generations earlier still matched the surviving monuments on the ground. The legal boundaries had remained remarkably stable even while the landscape above them had completely changed. Emily organized every exhibit into chronological order because she wanted the evidence to tell its own story without exaggeration. One afternoon, she placed a single sheet of paper in front of me. It was a timeline beginning with my great-grandfather's purchase of the ranch, continuing through each recorded easement agreement, then ending with the development approvals for Silver Creek Estates. One space remained empty. Between the easements and the subdivision approvals, there was no recorded deed transferring ownership. No sale, no conveyance, no probate distribution to another owner. Simply silence. Sometimes, Emily said, tapping the empty space with her pen, what is missing becomes the strongest evidence in the entire case. Before filing anything, she contacted attorneys representing the Homeowners Association and invited them to review the historical documents voluntarily. The response arrived several days later. They acknowledged receiving the materials but maintained that the neighborhood had operated in good faith for many years and that existing property records reflected long-established expectations. Their letter carefully avoided addressing the absence of any recorded transfer from the Carter family. Emily smiled slightly after reading it. That tells me they understand the question, she said. They simply do not have an answer yet. Rather than rushing into public accusations, we continued strengthening the record. Independent survey reports were added. Certified archive copies were authenticated. Every map, photograph, and measurement was cross-referenced until each piece supported the next. There were no dramatic confrontations, no raised voices, and no attempts to embarrass anyone. The process felt almost quiet. Yet beneath that calm, something important was happening. For the first time in decades, every official record connected to the ranch was being examined together instead of separately. The story that had slowly drifted apart over many years was beginning to assemble itself again, one verified document at a time, and I realized we were no longer trying to prove that my grandfather had been right. We were simply allowing the land's own history to speak with the clarity it had possessed all along. The courthouse was quieter than I expected. There were no television cameras waiting outside, no crowd gathered on the front steps, and no dramatic speeches echoing through the hallway. It was simply another civil hearing on the court's calendar, scheduled between several unrelated property disputes. Yet for me, it carried the weight of generations. I walked into the courtroom carrying the same worn leather folder that had been in my hands the morning the security guard told me I was trespassing. This time, however, the folder held far more than a single deed. It contained decades of history that had finally been assembled into one complete record. Claire Donovan sat with the attorneys representing the Homeowners Association several rows away. When our eyes briefly met, neither of us appeared angry. We both understood that opinions no longer mattered. The documents would speak for themselves. Emily Brooks began by presenting the chain of title, starting with my great-grandfather's original purchase and continuing through every recorded transfer within the Carter family. Certified copies from the county archives confirmed that ownership had remained uninterrupted for generations. Next came the original boundary survey preserved inside my grandfather's cedar chest. Mark Ellis explained how the surviving iron monuments matched the historic field notes within modern surveying tolerances despite the passage of decades. Large display boards showed transparent overlays comparing the original survey with present-day satellite imagery. The courtroom remained remarkably quiet as each layer aligned almost perfectly. Roads, utility corridors, walking trails, and landscaped common areas repeatedly traced easements that had granted limited access while explicitly preserving ownership. Then Emily placed one document after another before the court. Utility easement, road maintenance easement, drainage easement. Every agreement contained nearly identical language. Permission granted. Ownership retained. No conveyance of title. Those same words appeared again and again until their consistency became impossible to overlook. The association's attorneys acknowledged that the neighborhood had been developed through approved planning processes and that homeowners had purchased their properties believing every transaction was legitimate. Emily agreed. She made it clear that neither I nor my family questioned the good faith of the residents. The issue before the court was not whether families deserved stability. The issue was whether recorded ownership had ever legally changed. The judge reviewed the exhibits carefully, occasionally comparing one map against another while asking precise questions about survey references and recording dates. Hours passed without raised voices or dramatic interruptions. Everything depended upon measurements, legal descriptions, and official records that had existed long before anyone built the first house. Finally, the court returned to the one question that had followed me since standing outside the entrance gate. Was there any recorded instrument transferring ownership of the Carter Ranch from my family to another owner before the subdivision was created? After reviewing the evidence presented by both sides, the answer remained the same. None could be produced. The judge concluded that the historical record established continuous ownership by the Carter family, while recognizing that generations of homeowners had relied upon development records created under a mistaken interpretation of earlier easement rights. Rather than ordering disruptive consequences for innocent residents, the court directed the parties to work through a structured legal resolution correcting title issues, boundary responsibilities, and long-term property arrangements under judicial supervision. Relief settled over the courtroom in a way I had not expected. Nobody celebrated. Nobody lost a home that day. Instead, the truth finally occupied the place where assumptions had stood for years. As I gathered my papers, Claire Donovan approached quietly. She looked at the original survey resting on top of the stack for a long moment before speaking. I believed we were protecting this community, she said. Softly, I nodded because I believed her. And I came here to protect my family's history, I replied. For the first time since returning to the ranch, those two goals no longer seemed impossible to reconcile. 3 months passed before the final legal corrections were recorded, and when I drove back through the entrance of Silver Creek Estates that autumn morning, the security gate opened without hesitation. The same oak trees still stretched across the western ridge, their leaves now glowing shades of gold beneath a bright blue sky. The neighborhood looked almost exactly as it had on the day I first arrived, except for one important difference. The story behind it had finally been corrected. Updated property records reflected the court's ruling, easement agreements had been clarified, and long-term arrangements were established that protected both my family's ownership rights and the residents who had purchased their homes in good faith. Watching children ride bicycles along the sidewalks no longer filled me with confusion. It reminded me that justice had never required destroying what innocent people had built. It had only required restoring the truth beneath it. I spent most of my time on the portion of the ranch that remained open pasture, bringing life back to the land my grandfather had loved for decades. Broken fences were repaired one section at a time. The old windmill turned again after careful restoration. Fresh cedar boards replaced weathered porch steps on the ranch house, while native grass slowly returned across fields that had been neglected for years. Every evening, I walked toward the line of mature oak trees where my grandfather and I had often stopped our horses to watch the sunset. Standing there, I could see both worlds at once. On one side stretched the quiet ranch that had shaped my childhood. On the other stood a thriving neighborhood that had become part of the community's future. Neither erased the other anymore. They simply existed within clearly understood boundaries. One afternoon, Claire Donovan drove out to the ranch without any attorneys or official documents. She stepped onto the restored porch, looked across the open pasture, and smiled with a humility I had not seen during our first meeting. I spent years believing I was protecting this community, she said. I never realized I had stopped asking how it began. I invited her to sit for a while, and together we looked across the fields in comfortable silence. Before leaving, She apologized for dismissing my questions before examining the history for herself. I thanked her for helping guide the community through the legal corrections after the court's decision. We both understood that accepting the truth had required courage from everyone involved. Inside the ranch house, I placed the original deed, the restored boundary survey, and my grandfather's handwritten note inside a custom display case mounted above the old oak desk. Visitors often noticed the survey first, but my eyes always went to the single sentence written on the folded piece of paper beneath it. Never confuse permission with ownership. Those words had guided every step of the journey without my realizing it. Looking back now, I understand that the most valuable inheritance my grandfather left me was never the 1,100 acres themselves. It was the patience to search for facts before reaching conclusions, the discipline to let evidence speak louder than assumptions, and the belief that truth does not become weaker simply because time passes. Land remembers. Records remember. Honest people eventually remember as well. Whenever the evening breeze moves through the oak trees and the restored windmill begins its familiar steady rhythm once again, I think about the morning I was told I did not belong on my own family's ranch. Those words once felt impossible to overcome. Today they serve only as a reminder that justice does not always arrive with noise, anger, or dramatic victories. Sometimes it arrives quietly, one verified document at a time, until history finally finds its proper place again.